Hello everyone, how are you? Everyone good? Great, come on. This is exciting. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Okay, so thanks for having me. I'm bang on brand as well, as you can tell. There was obviously something subliminal going on, so I don't know whether you can see me behind the carpet in the banner. So my name's Dominic Campbell. I run a company called FUTUREGOV, as Daniela said. There's two things that are strange about me in this service design world. One is, despite my surname, I'm not Scottish, seeing as Scotland seems to own about half of the whole service design industry. The other part is that I'm not a service designer or a designer of any description. So it's interesting how the committee have asked me to open the conference in that, and I quite like the self-disruption of that in many respects. It's kind of heretical to start with a non-designer, I think. What I'm going to be talking about is essentially how I've come to love service design and how it's become fundamental to the work that we do to try and disrupt local public services and actually bring some humanity back to the services that we come face to face with every day in our cities and in our local communities, and how design has played a crucial role in that. I've essentially spent an awful lot of my career designing for change. So in many respects, I'm almost a pop designer for organizational design and how working with strategies in order to use design for really trying to disrupt old school institutions like local government. So for me, as Daniela said again, like and we're in this recent book that came out, what we represent is this kind of blending between new worlds, this new kind of design where design is in transition, and it is actually design with a capital D, but also design with a small d, and we're all designers now, aren't we? And how those things can be brought together in order to change the world and to actually kind of create the kind of new world that we want to see and disrupt the institutions that were fit for purpose for the Victorians in Britain, but probably not so relevant in the 21st century, and how can we use design to actually think very differently about that? But also, again, as Daniela says, how can we bring other disciplines together with design to actually supercharge the impact of design and make sure that it is changing the world rather than just creating beautiful objects and describing a world that may be different, but finding it difficult sometimes to actually take us to that new world. And lead us to a different kind of future. So while I'm not a designer, I'm actually a geographer by background, which I've found quite useful in the sense that it makes you fairly agnostic to both disciplines, tools, strategies, approaches to change and improving public services, which is what we focus a lot on. You tend to take a very broad view of the challenges that are in front of you. You look at things in a very sort of global perspective, quite literally, and you think about things in a very systems and processes point of view. So I found that there's been quite a natural marrying of that perspective with this sort of elegant beauty of design and the ability for design to actually unearth the detail of the world and the world that we're all trying to change, and actually help us with tools and processes to take us forward and to deliver a different future for us all and different organizations as part of that. This was where I learnt my trade. You'd be surprised to hear that an awful lot of geographers end up working in local government. It might be because there's no one else who wants to employ us, because we haven't got a discipline as such. But again, I think it's because most chief execs that I come across in some way or another have that kind of background where their focus is very much on place and communities, and how can you bring together a range of different power relationships, different actors in a local area, and try and change the processes and relationships between people, between one another, between them and institutions in their local area, in order to try and create the best outcomes for people in different local communities. And it was, for me, bizarrely, I wanted to work in local government from the age of about 16, which not many people would say, I would imagine. Shortly after deciding not to be a train driver, I wanted to work in local government, so nothing exciting for me on my career path so far. But what it did give me was, in many respects, you can't find a harder culture to work in some respects, to learn about old school, arcane institutions. This was Barnet Council in North London, where I spent 5 or 6 years at the beginning of my career. You won't mistake it for a hotbed of open design and innovation. You'll be lucky if you can actually see the front door and find a way in to talk to anybody, because that's not really the intention of local government. A lot of the time, they don't actually want to talk to their citizens. They would much rather just deliver services to you in a way that is useful to them as institutions, but really doesn't think carefully about how people live their lives and how local government is only one tiny fraction of somebody's life, if you're lucky. And really, they need to think a lot beyond that. And so I think that I've found over time that service design and design more broadly is an extremely useful mechanism for bringing that sort of elegant beauty of reality to bear on local public services, surfacing the messiness of reality rather than the neat way that government wishes that places worked and would like to be able to control people's lives and tell them what to do. Instead, things like design research are fantastic tools for actually revealing the messiness of reality and trying to get people to think very differently about how organizations are structured. And it was in local government that I became fascinated by technology. This was a system that I had to implement in my time in Barnet Council. I was one of a team there who essentially went round telling bright people that they were stupid because they couldn't use a stupid system, which is an interesting way of doing change management and an interesting way of designing organizations. Essentially, it's determined by what a collection of developers in Germany decided was the way to run an organization, which to me feels slightly the wrong way around in terms of how to design organizations. And then ultimately, the design aesthetic for these systems as well is phenomenally bad and something that I've had a passion for changing over the last 6 years that we've been doing FUTUREGOV. Umir Hack, has anyone heard of Umir Hack? He's a big creative random thinker at Harvard. You should follow him on Twitter if you don't, because it's totally ridiculous, some of the stuff he tweets, but also fascinating. And he thinks very big about the future. But I think on this tweet, he caught my eye because he was talking about how techno-utopians don't understand how 3D printed laser unicorn robots aren't a substitute for a working society, very much pointing to the fact that we're in an era of technologically led change where colleagues of mine sat in Tech City in London will sit in their closed office and design the technology of the future without actually thinking about whether people will use it and whether they should use it, whether they should give a toss about it, whether it's actually useful to the world. And that's something that I'm passionate, that I think design and technology together can really start to resolve, rather than the two things too often being sat apart from one another. Because I think that some of the cutting edge technology that we're seeing being used for really trivial outcomes could be used for so much more in society. And really we try and make it our mission to find the best of those innovations and to apply them to some really challenging social problems. So I'm going to confess that I used to think service design was a load of bollocks. I know there's a load of non-Brits here, so a load of rubbish. That is just where I came from originally. I was a change manager inside local government. I loved post-it notes as much as the next service designer. I knew how to use flip charts like you just would not believe. And to me, that was what service design was. That was really, it was nothing more than having fun, extracting some bright ideas from people, running interesting workshops that result in no change. And it's taken me time to understand the sort of the nuances of service design and to really understand where the value comes. And I think it's something that I would encourage us to think about over the next 48 hours is how do we actually make service design inherent and well understood and actually done in a meaningful, adopted and done in a meaningful way, in that it becomes second nature to people in terms of people who are making policy, people who are running government or organizations. Because a lot of the time, I think from the outside, it can look slightly trite or trivial. It can look far too much fun for its own good. And it's sometimes people struggle to see where the impact of service design is actually on the ground and how people can see where the change is coming from as a result of design and the effort that goes into it. But I feel that the key that when I'm going out selling, particularly as somebody who isn't a trained designer, go out selling service design and other design approaches, for me it's about how do we hold on to the empathy and the humanity that design exposes and brings to a process. How do we actually make sure that that is the unique feature of service design, that you really are the sort of evangelists of customers, clients and residents in local areas to actually help break some of those power relationships and empower people in their own lives to change the world around them. And so where we are now is that FUTUREGOV is gone through a few iterations. There's 35 of us. That essentially splits down into the three parts that Daniela talked about earlier. So we have designers, technologists, and change managers. Most of the change people are ex-government people who were frustrated in their jobs, couldn't make change happen fast enough, and have had to step outside of the system in order to have a bigger systems impact, to be able to change organizations at a bigger level. And then in our toolkits, what they have is the designers and the technologists to come in and support them to think very differently about the way that they do things. And I went through an interesting journey with this, in that FUTUREGOV started as a change consultancy, and it was all about trying to persuade people that their organization needed to be different, and that after a while that becomes frustrating because you're generating ideas, you're writing reports, and then you're leaving, and lo and behold, nobody is changing anything. They just remain as words. And the real beauty of bringing in design and technology skills into FUTUREGOV is that it has given us the kind of toolkit to be able to hardwire change into the system, to be actually able to develop and deliver new products and services that inherently change behaviors, inherently change relationships. And actually those three things together are a really powerful force for change. This isn't a brag or a humble brag, but it's interesting that just recently we received some investment from a social venture capitalist, but also from a local government. I believe it's probably the first time a local authority has ever bought equity in a design and technology firm. It's rather unusual. But for me, what it said to me more than anything on the broader sense, if I was looking in from the outside, is that this stuff is being taken seriously. For good and for bad. Some people are taking it seriously because they're scared of it and they want to control it, and they fear that change is happening too fast. But there are others who are really embracing it and really seeing what we're all doing in this room as the future and as the way that we're going to transition from one world to the next. Because for me, it feels like we are really at that kind of break point in the world, whether you're working in government or corporations or in social enterprise and in communities. We're fundamentally at a moment of huge transition in the world where we have this opportunity where I think design is coming into its own. This is a lovely diagram which was developed by a couple of former colleagues of mine. So When Leo was the chief executive to the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, he was doing some thinking to try and help sort of conceive what this shift in society is and what the role of government needs to be in this new kind of networked society. So the way they talked about it was a shift from new public management, which has been the traditional way of running government, very hierarchical, very performance management driven, very top-down way of delivering services, but to a new world of communicative governance where networks are the new currency, where relationships are key, where hierarchies are being disrupted, where open is the new closed. And again, I think this frames an awful lot of our work. I mean, even the transition of the design discipline itself is going through a bit of a bumpy ride from the people I hang out with in terms of this shift from a closed professional discipline to one which is much more about open collaborative design. But I think that if we resolve that conversation, again, open design has a real role to play in helping us move from one world to the next. And in terms of new behaviors and new ways of thinking, again, this is the sort of world we find ourselves in. It's about open collaboration, authenticity, transparency, a humanity and an honesty, particularly driven by the internet. There's no two ways about it, that kind of mass open communication has led to this huge change in society. But also that is being felt in pretty much every institution and organization that we have, and none more so than in government. Government is very good. It has an extremely strong immune system. It is very good at trying to slow down and control change. It is almost impenetrable in its nature. You would walk into a city government in many cities around the country or around the world, and you would believe that nothing had changed for the last 100 years, which I have huge admiration for in many respects. That takes an awful lot of work to maintain a very stagnant power base. But nevertheless, even in the government space, it feels like we're moving to a new kind of government. One that, some colleagues of ours who run the Personal Democracy Forum conference in New York, Andrea and Mika coined the phrase "WeGov," a very American phrase, I'd like to say, in the nicest possible way. But I get some stick for it in Britain, for it being cheesy. But I think it represents the shift quite nicely in that we had the e-government era where technology came along and we took a piece of paper and we turned it into a PDF and we put it on the internet. And then apparently public services were better for everybody, even though we'd essentially just redistributed the printing cost to our citizens instead of printing out the forms ourselves. But now really what we're seeing is, what is the new role of government in a world that is highly networked? What is the space that is unique that we need to maintain around protecting the vulnerable and safeguarding those who need it? But then how do we open up government to move beyond institutions? How do we actually think about, go back to thinking about public value? How do we think about the outcomes that we are trying to achieve, go back to basics and think, what kind of government do we want in 2014 were we to start from here, from a blank piece of paper with all of those things available to us that we have in 2014, whether it's design, the internet, whatever it might be. How do we actually focus back on public value, and how do we redefine government as not a building, but as all of us, and to actually move from receiving services from government, from a command and control structure, to thinking about the relationships that we have with one another and with government, and thinking about what kind of world collectively we can build. And so for me, that is why design is more important than ever. Because I think that the world is shifting. People, to a degree, feel a little out of control, particularly in government. They feel that it's shifting away from them. And they don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, but they have a sort of a public duty to feel that they are still serving their citizens and doing the best for their areas. And so what they need is support and a process through which they can help or be a part of creating that future. And for me, what we're finding around the UK, we do some work in Australia and elsewhere, where we're finding that an awful lot of the public sector is turning to design to help regenerate our institutions, to rethink how they look and how they operate, and how we can actually build something different in the future. But it's something that we have to fight for, and it's something that we can't take for granted. I'm already seeing signs of people waking up one day and calling themselves a designer, when the day before they were in fact somebody who wrote committee papers. This is something that we have to guard against, and I think, again, it is something we have to be very clear about how we articulate the value of design and actually what the core skills, disciplines, values of design are, and how do we inject those into these organizations. And what people are looking for is design to help them build a future that doesn't yet exist. Where design is really helpful to us is giving people the reassurance of a process through which change will happen, even though they don't know what that change will look like. Previously, people have been used to writing a business case, to procuring a service, to spending 18 months implementing something. So from start to finish, a process of change might take 3 or 4 years before you've even started. What we're finding is that people have a renewed appetite for prototyping, for testing, for doing things quickly and learning and moving forward. And people are starting to get it. And that's because we're giving them the reassurances of a process. And I think that's one of the benefits of design. There are downsides of that, but I think that process, especially when that process can be co-opted and misapplied, but I do think that process is massively beneficial in terms of helping people. But it helps with open questions, it helps with complexity, it helps with people's imagination, because not everybody wakes up one day and thinks about a new public service they want to create, or something that they necessarily want to change. So they need a way through that, and they need to be supported by design as a discipline to be comfortable with that. And in my opinion, public services are the most important thing that we can possibly focus design on at the moment. People deserve design. People deserve the best from us. People deserve the public services that are at least as good as every other service they come into contact with in the rest of their lives. Because this shit matters. This stuff is real. This is the most important end of our society, where people are at the receiving end of certain unfortunate power relationships that mean that they need support at certain points in their lives to be able to achieve what they want to achieve. And they're the most human services possible, where a lot of the time people don't have a choice. They can't choose between one service and another. They actually just get their public service. And so what we need to do is really raise expectations in government and really show them what the future could look like, how we could actually be competitive with the best corporations, the best of Silicon Valley, how we could make the most elegant products and services on the planet that just happen to do child protection or supporting vulnerable older people, rather than actually trivial nonsense that often comes out of Silicon Valley and receives $14 billion valuations. This is the stuff that matters. And for me, I think a lot of this, what we need to do as well is to understand at what points we're using what approach in terms of organizational change and what kind of design process we need in which situation. So there are times where people think that we're mad because we're, as a company and as a group of people, because we're committed to local government and the people that work in it, the organization, because we believe in those people. We believe that they are doing it for the right reasons. They may not have all the tools, they may not have the right imagination, but they are there for the right reasons. But that stuff is hard, and often that's just ducked. And I've found over time that an awful lot of designers have found that a very difficult place to work, because often the design mindset is to run free and wild and to be creative and think about something in a perfect world, where this stuff is messy and complex. And we need to somehow bring the best of the modern together with the best of our past and design new organizations that can meet people's needs. Sometimes you just have to not do that. There are times where those institutions are a lost cause, where the power relationships are too difficult, and the best thing you can possibly do is design a different organization and a different universe outside of it and lead those people to that parallel universe. because I don't believe everything is good about the institutions that we've inherited at all. Sometimes people need something that can stimulate their imagination and take them forward. But they also need safe places where they can practice the future. You don't want to be practicing new ways, radical new ways of doing child protection on live cases necessarily. You might want to. It's extremely high risk. So instead you need places where people can practice and learn. Because for us, we come across so many people, whether it's at hackathons, designathons, in organizations, in innovation labs, that have great ideas. And the world is full of good intentions and great ideas, and that's fantastic. But putting up a blog with a fancy graphic on it and a great idea behind it is not the same as changing the world. It is not the same as how do you land that in reality and give people a new lived experience of the services that they receive. So how do we actually ensure that delivery is everything? In some respects, services like the government digital service in Britain, I would have preferred to be the government delivery service, because fundamentally it is about delivery first and what tools you use, whether it's digital, design, change management, whatever else it might be, political levers. It is about delivery and change at the end of the day. And without that, design is nothing. Because what you need is the resilience that change brings. I employ ex-government people because they understand the system. They know how to get around the system. They know how to break the system. They know how to persuade the system that we're on their side and then change things in a very radical way. And then tech as well provides the kind of reach and impact that can hardwire change and change behaviors for real. But then design as well brings its own key advantages. It asks the right questions. It helps us think very carefully about the right problems. We find that most of the time with government, we're actually saying no to things. We're doing design discovery with people and saying, you don't know enough about this to go forward. There's no evidence that this will improve somebody's life. Let's go back around that research again. Let's think about what we're doing. Let's stop doing things. Because a lot of the time, design as saying no is actually extremely useful as a discipline to actually stop things being a waste of time in the first place, as well as building elegant new solutions that are focused around human beings. And as I say, empathy is the thing that I now, as an outsider to the design world, as I still feel despite working in it for 10 years in one way or another, it feels to me that service design and design more broadly, in all of that, humanity and empathy are the two things that is special about it and is the thing that government is craving from the design community right now. We almost can't service the demand for designers in public services right now because people really understand they need different ways of looking at the world. They need to be able to understand how the world works before they can actually think about changing the world and moving forward, and empathy is crucial to that. And then what I've also found and learned over time is that design has a real, and service design in particular, has a massive passion for process. This really surprised me. How on earth can people committed to humans and so empathetic be so obsessed with process? I came out of a world of Prince 2 and hardcore project management thinking that I was going to have fun with a bunch of designers floating around with post-it notes. Lo and behold, you guys love process. This was a photo of the numerous versions of a design process that were up in a design council recently at a meeting. And this isn't the half of it. What is it with process in you guys? Fascinating. I see a lot of the benefits, right? Like I really think that a purposeful design engagement needs a lovely process. But it's very interesting that we continue to redesign process after process. And of course, we have our beloved double diamond. And that is hugely important to all of us. But we're also seeing the kind of mashup of new design approaches as well, where GDS in the UK has its government's service design manual. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. But again, they're trying to mash together digital and design as a way of essentially bringing about change in organizations and in government as something which takes us away from the sort of extracted simplicity of the double diamond into something that is meaningful and real for government. And hallelujah, NESTA have now published the mother of all toolkits as well. Never again do any of you need to pen any tools for your workshops or any process that we're all doing. It was the biggest sigh of relief that went around my service design team when this website went up, so that we don't have to keep reinventing our discipline over and over again, but instead we have a core place to pull it together. And obviously there's design from other perspectives as well. Just before I go into these slides, this is a joke, just so you're aware. This is not serious. This is my little take on how a management consultant might see the design process. So obviously PowerPoint gives you some beautiful, helpful diagrams to help you come up with a design process. So this might be how they see it. Design's a beautiful straight line, and we're seeing an awful lot of this. Some of the big four consultancies, we're now designers. We were sort of Prince 2 qualified consultants yesterday, but today we're a designer because we have a flow diagram that takes you from here to there because the world is this simple. Or it might be a machine. Is the design process a machine? I don't know. It says it is in PowerPoint, so there must be some use for that. And then what the hell is this diagram about? I don't even know what's happening here. But that's possible, just a little insight into how management consultants may see the design process as we're going forward. So that's some of the stuff that we need to guard against, because I'm seeing an awful lot of this stuff co-opted, and we have to ensure that we're not navel-gazing and that we're actually putting out the best face of service design and setting a very high standard to be able to say this is how you actually ensure that design is done well. Because there is this real trend towards everybody believing they're a designer. And you've got the different extremes, right? You've got designer with a capital D, which I would imagine most of you are, sort of the lovey darling, I'm a designer, I've got a degree designer, no offense. And then at the other end, you have the policy wonk who woke up and decided they were a designer with a small d, and everything in between. And for me, this just sort of represents how trendy it is, how much of an appetite there is. And the positive side of that is you've obviously won some amazing fights in persuading people that your processes and your approaches are working and are changing the world. Otherwise, people wouldn't find it so damn cool to associate themselves with design. But at the same time, we've got to guard against the fact that neither can we be too arrogant about protecting design, nor can we be complacent and just allow design to become an abused word like innovation has over time. So how do we ensure, instead of sitting back and saying, I should be a highly paid designer, how do we ensure design literacy? How can we do code clubs for designers in primary schools? How do we ensure that design as a discipline is being democratized and being spread amongst the community from the very early stages in people's education, so that when they move into organizations, one, they may never move into them because they actually start a startup instead, which is a hugely increasing trend of designers being employed in the startup community. But also, how could they also think very differently about the organizations they're working in? How can we use it as a sort of viral disruption for the world that we exist in? And as I say, design can't do it alone. I think where I first came to design was that I was presented with very beautiful communication design outcomes where I'd asked when I was in local government for studies on how the community is engaging, what their views are with the council and how we can move it forward. And an awful lot of the time what came back to me was a very beautiful PDF which really represented the beauty of the community I was talking about, but at the same time didn't really give me a mechanism for it essentially got me 10% of the way and didn't actually give me any answers as to how I could change the world. It was very descriptive and very elegant, but it didn't actually help me change things. And that's where we found over time these three disciplines are extremely powerful in making change happen. And especially powerful when you get them to play well together. So up here on the left, you've got a change manager sacking somebody with a great big tackle, and then round here on down beneath you've got the designer running off through the empty gap making the score, which is essentially how I see the company working. I've got my change managers who are essentially brilliant at managing the politics of organizations. They're really great at headbutting players out of the way so that they can actually enable designers and technologists to design the world of the future. But if you didn't have those, It would be that designer down there who would be on the receiving end of that player who's just got his ass knocked to the floor. That's what would be happening. So you need these complementary disciplines together in order that you can actually make the change and impact on the world that you want. It takes a very unusual designer to be able to both headbutt a player and then run through and score. Very unusual. And so you need to ensure that you've got the right blend of disciplines in any team that you put together. Because for me, what the focus needs to be on is not process. It's about what is the end of that process. How do we ensure momentum? How do we ensure progress and forward momentum over perfection? How do we say, okay, that toolkit is good enough? How do we say that that elegant pixel is done now with that web code? I've nailed it. How can we move on and actually think about what are the outcomes that we're trying to get to and work as a team to actually get us there? So in terms of what we've been doing, in terms of some of the projects that we've been working on to make all of this high theory of mine happen, what we focus on predominantly are two things. On the one side of the business, it is fundamentally deeply engaging with organizations to think very differently about who they want to be, create a sort of design-led innovation culture, and then inside of that, land new services and products that we've developed both with users, practitioners, and others in order to start moving them forward. But one without the other is a very difficult play because you're essentially selling products and services to a market that's 10 or 20 years behind. And what you need to do is actually generate the kind of conditions for innovation before you can actually get them to move forward. So some work we've been doing with Surrey County Council, who are now our business partners. We have a beautiful linear process. This itself was probably a 6-month conversation between every level of the organization right up to the chief executive. Everybody has an opinion on how many Ds a design process should have. Interestingly, you'll notice that decide snuck in to the process, which is kind of beautifully local government in many respects. We can't possibly design something and let it happen unless we've sat down and had a committee paper and a decision-making process in order to let it into the wild. So we kind of compromised on that. Again, much more focused on the outcomes than the sort of perfection of a design process and ensuring that we'd won that fight. So we compromised. And so what we've been doing is running a design lab with them inside Surrey for the last 15 months now, where we've had a team of 3 or 4 people, they've had a team of 3 or 4 people, and we've been focused very strongly on, at the center, trying to demonstrate what does a really amazing, modern, future-gazing public service look like? How do we actually move things forward? How do we show people what good enough looks like? Because people need to see it. They need to touch it. Otherwise, they haven't got a bar to aim for. Then around that, we've supported other ideas and projects, and we've ensured that there's been skill transfer, the democratization of design. Again, they're not necessarily trained designers. They haven't spent 4 or 5 years at a university, and they haven't gone up through the ranks. But nevertheless, they need enough design to be sure that we are confident that they are elegantly rethinking these services, and we're amplifying our impact on the organization rather than just saying, well, if we don't do it, it's not good enough, so we're not going to do it. And instead saying, come on, let's just see what we can do together. And then around that, it's a community of innovators to try and think about the next wave of projects as well. To their credit, they whitewashed 4 rooms in a building that looked very much like my Barnet experience in the beginning of my career. You're walking down corridors with wood on the wall, and then suddenly you're in Google, which is kind of amazing. People take their ties off to be in meetings. They stand up in meetings. These things may sound like second nature to you, but trust me, meetings that are 20 minutes long and called stand-ups instead of 2-hour-long boredom snooze fests is a very new thing to government. And so all of these things are really important in terms of changing organizational culture. And how you talk about it as well, and the relationship you're building both with the organization and outside the organization is important. Words matter hugely, so I would never denigrate the sort of comms design angle on this, because it is a fundamental part of the cheerleading process to actually win hearts and minds and excite them and to think the world can be different and try and get them to move there. And we do things like, you know, the design artifacts that you guys will be so familiar with, whether it is the toolkit, whether it is illustrated minutes, whether it is, you know, putting up bunting in a room and pretending that you're not at work and you can actually have fun while doing work, is all part of winning hearts and minds and ensuring the right kind of culture to make change happen. And a sort of relentless exposure to reality as well is vital. So how do you actually drag people out to the community or bring the community into them so they can't get away with not understanding the reality of people's lives and cannot sit back arrogantly and pretend that if they deliver a service like they've always delivered it, then the world won't fall apart. Whereas these are mothers of children with special educational needs in West Sussex who are very clear about what they need for their families and what they need for their children. And they're very clear about what role they think government should and shouldn't play in those situations. And so they're really fundamental to the design process. And it's a replicable process. We've taken that design lab and we've moved it around the country. We've done it in East Sussex and West Sussex, and we're talking with places like Wakefield and others, and Melbourne, Australia, where we do some work as well. And so that again is the beauty of the process mind, of the service design mindset on the process side, is that it does actually give you a codified change product that means you can actually make change happen on a replicable basis. You'll see here in West Sussex, they came up with their own design process, which was the much more stripped back, simplified version of the SURREY one. Again, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're ensuring that people are getting enthused and getting the skills to make change happen. And a friend of mine, James Governor, or Monk Chips, as he's known on Twitter, coined the phrase scaling craft, which I think captures quite nicely where a lot of these design projects, design-led projects are. How do we actually move beyond sort of nice little experiments that point to or give us a little kind of shaft of light into the future, but actually don't get us there? How do we actually make sure those things are scalable, replicable, and achievable in a way that means that all of our collective work actually adds up to a new way of working and a new world out there? And for me, the Jonathan Ive quote around needing to understand how a product is made in order to understand the product itself is totally fundamental. And again, a huge selling point for design, in my opinion, because it is actually the process of product development and service development that is almost as important as the service and the product itself in the journey that people go through in changing hearts and minds, and also recognizing that the things that we deliver are actually built on the foundations of what people need and want, rather than what we think is cool or is a nice thing to do. And it really does bring new products and services a different kind of credibility in public services when you're talking with people who work with vulnerable adults on a day-to-day basis. When you have the credibility that service design brings you of saying, well, we've spent an awful lot of time with your clients and with their family. We really understand the lives that they live, and we have evidence of why we're developing a prototype in this way, because it actually meets their needs and it actually will do what they want it to, rather than this thing that you've just decided to build or to develop because you think it sounds good. Well, we actually have real evidence that this stuff can change it. So I'm going to run through two projects really quickly and then I'll be done. Just to give you an example of where this stuff is really having impact and where it's starting to deliver at scale. So in order to try and, we're kind of the mindset of go big or go home in many respects. We were at a point a few years ago where we were frustrated by the lack of understanding and the lack of belief in design and digital as well, frankly, as a transformative tools within government. So we actually chose an extremely sticky problem that we were massively passionate about to solve in order to try and buy the credibility that we thought was important in order to be able to say, well, if it can solve this problem, it can solve any of your problems. And that was child protection. So we developed Patchwork as a way of trying to show all of the people in a local area that are working with a child or a family or other people. And what the initial intention was, if we'd just come from a tech perspective and from quite a, to be honest, manly perspective, a bloke generally says, well, the problem is we haven't got a piece of technology that aggregates all the data together. And then that's what we would have built. But we've got a million examples in the UK and elsewhere of where that's failed. The NHS Spine or Contact Point, which was a kind of a precursor to Patchwork in many ways, although I would never like to say that really. But that stuff just doesn't happen because it's coming from a from Umair Haq's techno-utopian sort of very sort of separate to human perspective on what people need. So instead what we did was hang out with Jeffrey the social worker and a bunch of his colleagues for an awful long time and really understood where the problem was. And it wasn't a data problem. Like, people don't want any more data. They have so much data. They have more data than they know what to do with. I know data is very trendy right now and there's great things you can do with it, but generally what it showed us was it's all about human relationships. People just want to know who else is involved and how they can get hold of them at the right time to ask a question. So instead we essentially came up with a supercharged phone directory. It sounds really boring, right? It sounds like bloody obvious. Most of the internet ultimately veers towards being a contact book. But that aside, what people wanted. It was what people wanted. They wanted to find each other. They wanted to discover each other, see the connections, and be able to phone each other or email each other and come together and avoid things being dropped. And we've had to fight for this project, as you'd imagine. We've probably done what I would have expected in 1 year in 4 years, because there's been things around child protection, highly sensitive services, data protection, consent. The sort of human side of it is 90% of the battle. The technology is really, really easy in comparison. And without that combination of design, tech, and change, in my opinion, we would have neither had the insight to understand that it wasn't a technology data problem, it was a human connection problem. We wouldn't have had the sort of elegant technology that can build something quickly and simply that does what people need and nothing more. And we wouldn't have had the resilience of change to be able to actually fight for 4 years, because we know this is what people need, because clients were telling us it's what they needed, because frontline social workers were telling us it's what they needed. It's what managers were telling us it wasn't what they needed. And managers are the ones who hold the budgets and they're the ones who procure things. And we didn't give a shit. We just kept fighting through it because we knew we were right, because we had the evidence and because we knew what would change things. And now we're rolling out across the UK. We've got a big implementation going on in Australia. So whether it works in the long run, like for now, we've won some arguments and we're starting to solve some problems, and it was worth it. And so many projects I see would have given up at either the insight or the initial prototyping perspective. And what you need to find is allied skills and allied approaches to your work that gives you the resilience and protection and support that can actually deliver on your big ideas and can actually help make your insight a reality, because the world needs it. We're doing the same in adult social care. Again, fighting. I was going to give these a different fight factor out of 10, like how much of a fight have all of these been. The first two were at least an 8 out of 10. Casserole was an interesting one. Both of the two before were about inside organisational change. Casserole, we tried to take to local government as an idea to reinvent Meals on Wheels and say we can use technology to connect people to cook for one another. You don't need to spend a lot of money on Meals on Wheels. We'll save you money. We'll do it better. The way that was received by local government was, you're trying to steal my budget saving. To which I said, I'm trying to steal 10 times more money than that, actually, because I don't think your saving is ambitious enough, because all you're trying to do is make your bad service slightly more efficient, whereas what I'm trying to do is create a brand new service that is far, far more efficient and cheap. So as you can imagine, that was a difficult sell and wasn't bought. So instead, we went and got innovation funding and set it up in that local area anyway, outside of the council, and funded it ourselves to prove a point, because we knew again that this just had to happen and the world needed to see whether this could be real and whether we can have faith in people to donate a spare plate of dinner to each other and to connect and to be less socially isolated. So we did a 6-month prototype, we built the service, did really interesting little elegant things like inviting people to join through having a cake on their doorstep when they returned home from work. This is the stuff. This is design. Like, I love this stuff. The imagination and see, I can't do this shit. Like, it's amazing. Design is awesome. And then there's the amazing engagement processes, trying to like just be fun and lighthearted and think about serious things in an interesting human way and engage with people differently. And now we've got, again, casserole being used. Like every time I see a tweet saying, just delivered my first meal, had a really great 20-minute chat with whoever, like I cannot tell you the excitement that I get from that, because it has happened because, again, like we came up with something elegant and we just fought and fought and fought until it happened. She's perhaps not so happy about it, but maybe she had that sticker put on a bit hard. But again, we're starting to scale. So we now have over 4,000 cooks registered across the UK. The challenge is actually finding diners. If you're inherently socially isolated and digitally isolated, as you tend to be if you're a diner that we're aiming for, how the hell do you find people like that? So what we've ended up doing is working council by council area, using social services, church groups, voluntary groups, because they're the civic infrastructure that we can find these people and support these people through. And again, it's been rolled out in a number of different areas now. And again, it's starting to move from craft to scale, but all the time we're reminded as to what the initial pilot was about. Who are the people who are involved? What is at the heart of this? It's not about some industrialized, dehumanized process. It's about every single human interaction between these communities that actually improves everybody's quality of life and improves public services as you go through it. And the last one was the Designathon, where one of our side projects is called Enable by Design, run by Denise, who is a friend of ours who has MS and decided that the world shouldn't just have really bad products just because you happen to be disabled. Why should you have a crutch that makes a noise when you walk down a corridor and people can hear you coming in a really embarrassing way? Why can't you have things that are as elegant as walking into Selfridges or somewhere else and having beautiful products that actually just fit around your life? And so what we did was instead of a technology hackathon, we did a products hackathon for 2 days. In the world of 3D printing and personalization, it's entirely possible that you can design things quickly and easily for people. So we brought together a bunch of users, we brought together people who had certain challenges. This is Paul. Paul is the muse of almost everything that has ever been designed through the Designathon. Anything that's designed for Paul generally wins a Designathon for some reason. But as you can see, he was having a challenge with cutting. So people in 24 hours designed almost like a stapler that you can put your knife in so that he could actually just hit the top of the knife and cut things quite beautifully. And the people get rewarded with a 3D printed cup and Google sponsor it, and it's all very exciting. But again, slightly different to the other services that we're delivering, which are about a service and sort of a payment and a new way of doing a public service. This is the sort of new world of open source communities, of hardware hacking, of open sharing of designs and other things, to the extent where we've now done one in London. It was picked up in Washington, DC. So we've done one in Washington, DC. We're going to Sydney in July to do one. And we're not doing anything. We just open sourced the sort of process, that sort of Designathon toolkit. And people have been enthused and picked it up and done it for themselves. And this has been replicated around the world in different processes under different banners. But it's all very exciting and good for scaling. So in conclusion, I would say, design delights and excites, products hardwire change, and that's fundamentally important, whether they're digital or physical products. But design alone is not enough. Change is political. You need people who can play that political game and connect you into the systems that you're trying to change. You need the kind of resilience that can ensure that you stick with the problem until you've cracked it and not give up until you've done it. And just fight and fight and fight and never give up for that thing that you believe in. As long as you have that evidence, as long as you have that insight, as long as you believe in the thing you're doing, just build that team in the right way that gives you that 360-degree view on change. Focus on change and delivery and how design can help you support that. Because life is fundamentally too short not to do something that matters. Thank you very much.